Mr. Faisal, you may start now.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Faisal Parish, the Director of the Global Environment Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the IGEM 2021 session on greenhouse gas emission from Peatland Management in relation to Malaysia's commitment under the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Thank you very much for joining us for the next hour and a half, which I hope will be very informative for you. And we also hope we will have a good interaction and questions from you later in the session. So this is the program for this afternoon's session. We will have three presenters today talking on greenhouse gas emission from agricultural crops, greenhouse gas emission from management of peatland forests and plantations, and also the procedures for greenhouse gas accounting for peatlands used by the Malaysian government. We will then at 3 o'clock local time have a panel discussion, Q&A session for 20 minutes, and then summary and conclusion of the session and end. So just to give you a bit of background, the Global Environment Center, the main organizer together with IGEM, is a Malaysian non-profit organization. We've been operating 22 years based in Malaysia. We work in all the ASEAN member states, working with government, private sector, education and research institutes, civil society and community. And we've implemented 240 projects in 20 countries with 160 partners. We've been involved from the beginning in work on peatland management and restoration with a broad range of partners, in particular the ASEAN Secretariat and the 10 ASEAN member states through the ASEAN Peatland Management Strategy, as well as private sector partners through the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil and many international partners. Peatlands in Malaysia are our most extensive wetland ecosystem, covering nearly 8% of the land area of Malaysia and 2.56 million hectares. In their natural state, peatlands in Malaysia are covered with a dense tropical forest, but under that canopy, under the soil, are the most important ecosystem for carbon storage. They're also critical in regulating greenhouse gases. Methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide are the key gases regulated by peatlands. Land conversion, drainage, and fires are the main root cause or drivers of greenhouse gas emission from peatlands. Overall, globally, peatlands are the most important ecosystem as far as carbon storage, storing 25% of the world soil carbon in only 3% of the land area. Drained and degraded peatlands are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, releasing up to 6% of global anthropogenic CO2 emissions annually. Protection and rehabilitation of peatlands can therefore play a very key role in reduction of global and local emissions. In Malaysia, the peatlands provide a critical buffer against flooding and insurance against drought by providing a water supply, as well as being critical for biodiversity and local communities. But the effective management of peatlands is also very critical to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and meeting Malaysia's targets. Malaysia has recently, in July 2021, submitted an updated nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. In this NDC, Malaysia pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emission intensity by 45% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. In addition, a few days ago, on 27th of September, the Malaysian Prime Minister announced the target for Malaysia to become carbon neutral by 2050. In this context, it's very critical that Malaysia focuses over the coming years on proper and effective management of peatlands and reduction of emissions from peatland ecosystems. It is possible through integrated management practices, better water management, control of fire, modification of drainage and water management systems, and multi-stakeholder engagement to reduce and minimize the emission from peatland ecosystems. and also revert them back to a situation where they can once again be storing or taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So our conference session today, the objective is to bring together different stakeholders to share experience and findings related to greenhouse gas emissions of peat in relation to the commitment under the Paris Agreement of the UNFCCC. We hope that you will learn how we can all be agents of change by understanding the growing challenges to reduce greenhouse gas emission from peatland in Malaysia and to drive sustainable peatland restoration and maintenance efforts by supporting various multi-stakeholder initiatives and programs, as well as continuing to challenge Malaysian leaders, both in the public and private sectors, to continue in the efforts towards the goal, as stated by the government recently, of national carbon neutrality by 2050. So during the session, we're going to have about just under 1 hour with the presentations, about 50 minutes. During that time, you'll be able to see the presentations on your screen. And just below the presentation, there is a bar where you can submit comments and questions. So please, during the course of the session, do share your questions as early as possible after each or during each presentation. Do pose those questions, and then we will organize them and try to respond to as many questions as time permits in the Q&A session, which is starting at 3 o'clock. So let me just introduce the panel of 3 eminent speakers that we have today. Firstly, Dr. Hamid Shukri Mat Ali, who is the Director of Agrobiodiversity and Environment Research Center of the Malaysian Agricultural Research and Development Institute, MADI. He'll be talking about greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural crops on peat. Dr. Muhammad Shukri has a PhD in plant science from the University of Glasgow and 21 years experience on research and development of plant science and plant genetic resources. He's responsible over the years of management and research on a broad range of activities: gene bank, seed center, industrial crop research, horticulture research, and currently he leads the Agrobiodiversity and Environment Research Center, looking at environment and climate change, conservation and utilization of plant genetic resources, and biological control. Our second panel member is Dr. Stephanie Evers. She's the founder and principal investigator of the Tropical Catchment Research Institute, which TRCARI, which was established a number of years ago in partnership between the Nottingham University Malaysia campus and a broad range of other Malaysian and other international universities and research centers. She's worked on wetland ecosystems for more than 18 years, including 10 years in the tropics, based in Malaysia. She leads the TRCARI collaborative program with institutes and has also researched a lot on greenhouse gas emissions as well as rehabilitation of peatland ecosystems. Our third speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Phillip. She's the CEO of the newly established Malaysian Forest Fund. She has a PhD in plant physiology. She has been very active in many areas, including pioneering or leading the process of the RED Plus initiative and roadmap development at the national level, working with the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources. She is active, been engaged in the roster of experts for land use change and forestry of the UNFCCC, and been involved in many steps towards documenting and reporting on Malaysia's greenhouse gas emission from the forest and land use sector. She's currently the CEO of the Malaysian Forest Fund. Thank you and welcome again to our panel of speakers. We're going to start off with the first presentation on greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural crops on peat. And I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Hamid Shukri Mat Ali from MADI to speak on this important subject. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good day to all. First of all, thank you to the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity to share some of the research that have been conducted in MARDI, which relates to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, GHG, on peat soil. The title of my presentation today is Greenhouse Gas GHG Emissions from Agricultural Sector in Malaysia. So this is the overview of my presentation. So the overview, it can be divided into two parts. The national reporting on GHG, which includes estimates emissions from peat under agriculture activities. And then I would like to share on MARDI's ongoing research on GHG carried out through MARDI Research Station in Saratok, Sarawak. I will end my presentation with conclusion. As an introduction, greenhouse gas, so GHG, can be defined as any gas that has the property of absorbing infrared radiation or net heat energy emitted from Earth's surface and radiating it back to Earth's surface, thus contributing to the greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor are the most important greenhouse gases. To a lesser extent, surface level ozone, nitrous oxides, and fluorinated gases also trap infrared radiation. So Malaysia has recorded total GHG emissions of 316,800 gigagram carbon dioxide equivalent as of 2016. And the energy sector was the highest contributor to the GHG emissions at 79.4%, followed by the industrial processes and product use, or IPPU, and waste sector both contributed to 8.6%. Currently, agriculture contributions to emissions were estimated at 10,627 gigagram carbon dioxide equivalent, which is about 3.4% of the total national emissions. And carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions amounted to 78% of total GHG emissions, and methane and nitrous oxides emissions amounted to 18% and 3% respectively. Malaysia has submitted the report to the National Communications, or NC, every 4 years, and biennial update report, or BUR, every 2 years to the United Nations Framework Convention and Climate Change, or what we call as UNFCCC. So Malaysia has contributed and submitted since 2000 and 2011, in March 2016, September 2018, and the latest was on December 2020 as the third biennial update report. So the latest methodology used for the TNC, or the second biennial report, is submitted in 2018, and third biennial update report, BUR3, in 2020, followed the IPCC, or the International Panel on Climate Change Guidelines, 2006. Well, previously, Malaysia used IPCC 1996 guideline for all national reports. However, under the 2006 guideline, agriculture sector has to combine with forestry sector, which will be reported as agriculture, forestry, and land use sector, or AFOLU. Hence, for this presentation, we will focus only for MAFI, or the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Industry, and MARDI current domain, which is to report emissions from agricultural sector. At the national level, report on GHG emissions for forestry sector was carried out by FRIM, the Forest Research Institute of Malaysia. Well, this figure shows sources of emissions from agricultural subsectors based on the latest report on the BUR3. If you can see, the major source of emissions can be divided by direct and indirect emissions. The direct source is the nitrous oxides, or N2O, emission, which accounted approximately 38%, 38% of the total agricultural emissions. Second is methane from rice cultivation, followed by enteric fermentation and indirect N2O emissions. So based on the figure on the slide. And there was only slight increase in the emissions between 2015 to 2016 for all subsectors categories. So the key source of emission is the same. If you can see from the table for 2015 and 2016. Major source of emissions is from the direct nitrous oxide emissions, followed by methane from rice cultivation, enteric fermentation, and indirect N2O emission. Yeah. Okay. In the next slides, we can see that total emission from agriculture in 2016 increased from 65% compared to 1990 and 8% compared to 2005. Yeah. Over the years, emissions are contributed mainly from increase in direct nitrous oxide emission, largely due to the increase in fertilizer use. Yeah. This was contributed mainly from the expansion of the oil palm industry. Larger areas of plantation require more fertilizer, which directly increase the GHG emissions. Other sector, for example, we can see methane emission from rice cultivation look stagnant. Yeah, this indicates that rice cultivation areas, which in parallel directly contributes to GHG, with only slightly increased throughout the years. You can see from the figure. And the figure shows the breakdown of the sources of GHG estimated under direct nitrous oxide emissions. You can see this includes volatilization from nitrogenous fertilizer applications for general agriculture use here under mineral soils, and flooded rice cultivation areas also under mineral, if you can see from the first 2 points on the figure. Yeah. So this is followed by the nitrous oxide emissions from managed organic soils, which estimate the N2O emission from agricultural sector under peat soil, the EF point number 3. Yeah. Then others include emission from urine and dung, livestock waste, if you can see on the EF point emission factor, yeah, number 4 and 5, yeah, on the table. Then estimate for the GHG emission from agricultural peat cultivation were carried out through various national consultation with experts and agency. So for peat soils, the emission factor used in the local emission formula, which was based on the study by Dr. Luli in 2007, while the figure for overall peat of managed organic soils and agricultural activities were estimated at 1.059 million hectares in 2016. Yeah, this figure was obtained basically through the national consultation during the preparation of the third biennial update report. Yeah, overall peat soil and agricultural activities contributes around 595.4 gigagram carbon dioxide equivalent, which is stated on the slide. Okay, we go for the next slide. Tropical peatlands, yeah, support significant portions of Malaysian export of oil palm, about 10%, and pineapple, almost 100% products. Besides safeguarding the export potential of these commodities, the country is also responsible for controlling carbon dioxide emission from the development of peatland. Information related to carbon dioxide emission in agricultural peatlands, however, is grossly lacking and not emphasized in the past. So, MARDI has embarked on research activities related to sustainable peatlands since 2001 at MARDI Saratok, Sarawak, which is the main peat research station of MARDI, and studies have provided some basic information, yeah, on the status and factors affecting carbon dioxide emission in tropical peatland, particularly if you can see carbon loss under agroecosystem from land use change, peat fires, drainage, crop type, and carbon loss correlation with temperature. We had conducted research on these 5 elements. And agricultural development involves land use changes, which bring about significant effects of carbon balance, handling, and management of former biomass determines the fate of carbon in the debris. So agricultural developments in Malaysia are commonly carried out on areas that are designated for development after intensive timber extractions. Such land at Mardi Saratok supported 147 species and 126 ton per hectare of biomass larger than 5 centimeter, which could contain about 50 ton carbon per hectare. Similar situation exists during replanting in oil palm cultivation. The MPOB estimated about 110 ton per hectare of dry biomass, equivalent to 55 ton carbon per hectare of old palms that need to be cleared for replanting, usually for palm oil, estimate about 25 years of cycle. In pineapple cultivation, it is estimated about 50 ton per hectare fresh pineapple residue, which may contain about 5 ton carbon per hectare that needs to be cleared for new planting or 2-year cycle. Peat fire is a major problem and source of carbon dioxide emission in peatland. The amount of carbon dioxide released from a peat fire depends on the area affected, thickness of the burnt soil, bulk density of the affected layer, and the type of peat material. So slash and burn, which is commonly practiced, or clearing technique operation at Mardi Saratok had resulted in 10 centimeter loss of peatland, which could release 50 ton carbon per hectare. During the initial stage of development, surface subsidence in peatland is mainly physical from the loss of buoyancy effect and compaction. Experiences at Mardi Saratok indicated that peat materials started to decompose or oxidize only about a year after drainage. So the process results in CO2 emissions and carbon leaching in the form of organic acids and organic particulates. And it was estimated that 7 ton carbon per hectare per year is released from 2 centimeter per year surface subsidence in IADP Johor Barat, where I studied from Mardi, particularly in Mardi Saratok, observed the release of 100 milligram carbon dioxide meter square per hour for every 10 centimeter depth as water table drop, based on our research. And then increase in soil temperature was reported to increase the decomposition process of organic materials in peatland. Studies from Mardi Saratok reported that carbon dioxide emission was highly correlated with soil temperature, which exhibited daily diurnal variation that ranged from 440 to 950 milligram carbon dioxide meter square per hour, where peak at noon based on the slash and burns method. Experiences at Mardi Saratok reported that carbon dioxide emission varies with crop type and emission, peak at noon. Highest soil carbon dioxide flux was all under oil palm, followed by pineapple, jackfruits, sweet potatoes, and secondary forests, based on the slide. Differences in the soil carbon dioxide flux was attributed to drainage, agronomic management, and water table depth or fluctuation. Then we move on to the GHG mitigation strategies for cultivated peat soils, which I am emphasized on Mardi's ongoing research, particularly in Rancangan Malaysia ke-11 or 11 National Plan. So due to the soil nutrient deficiency and high potential of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emission from cultivated peatlands, Mardi's R&D has been intensified to identify potential soil amendments that offers feasible approach to mitigate GHG emissions without reducing peat soil and crop productivity. Thus, 2 potential soil amendments are identified, particularly pineapple residues. Pineapple residues ash is produced on a small scale under control condition using a muffled furnace. So the ash is produced by air drying pineapple waste, followed by over drying at 80 degrees Celsius, after which it is incinerated at 300 degrees Celsius, and finally calcined at high temperature at 600 degrees Celsius. So the pineapple residues as produced was irish white in color, based on the flow chart on the slides from the air-dried pineapple waste up to the process, and then we can see the ash. Clinoptilolite zeolite is a hydrated zeolite mineral which has a wide application in agriculture. So various studies have demonstrated the ability of this zeolite to improve soil physical and chemical properties on marginal soils, particularly acidic, sandy, and clayey soils. Yeah, so our ongoing R&D indicated that the co-application of this zeolite and compound NPK fertilizers has improved soil NPK availability, NPK plant uptake, growth, and fruit yield of papaya cultivated on peat soil. So based on our study on papaya, so from the ash, we mix up with the usual fertilizer, so it actually improves the plant NPK intake. Ability of clinoptilolite zeolite to buffer the soil pH, reduce the need for liming, and co-application of the zeolite with compound NPK fertilizers on cultivated peat soils reduce approximately 40.2% of soil carbon dioxide emission and 48.3% of the nitrous oxide emissions. So the peat soil with clinoptilolite zeolite has improved the pH, nutrients, availability, and reduced GHG emission because of the absorption of these nutrients, carbon dioxide, and nitrous molecules within the structure framework of clinoptilolite zeolite through ion exchange, chemical, and physical absorption. So this is the plot in our research station in Sarawak where we planted Carica papaya, CV sekaki, for our research. So as a conclusion, overall agriculture contributes about 3.4% of emissions from the agricultural sector, with major source of emissions came from direct nitrous oxide emissions. So these include estimate emissions for agriculture activities under peat soils. So Mardi carried out the estimate for GHG emissions for agricultural subsector, while FRAME conduct the emission estimate for forestry subsector, as I mentioned previously. Together, both estimate reports were converged under AFO-LU sector according to the IPCC 206 guideline. So Mardi has also conducted a number of research for agriculture under peat soil cultivation, and these research were carried out in Mardi Sarato station. So in the long run, Mardi is committed to expand its research on mitigation activities, particularly for non-oil palm crops, and this is ongoing research carried out in Mardi Sarato based on our 12th National Malaysian Plan. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, thank you.
Cultural crops on peat. This has been a very enlightening input to the work done by Mardi and others on this important topic. Me move to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Stephanie Evers, who will be discussing on the issue of greenhouse gas emission from management of peatland forests and plantations. Dr. Evers, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name's Dr. Stephanie Evers. Thank you so much for inviting me to present here at IGEM. I'm with Liverpool John Moores University in the UK and also Nottingham University out in, here in Malaysia. So I'll just share my screen quickly. And start at the beginning. Okay, so as I said, I want to give you an overview of the peatland emissions from agricultural peatlands that we find in Malaysia. As you are probably aware, peatlands are exceptionally important ecosystems. They cover a small area comparatively of land surface area, but store about 1/3 of global soil carbon. And you can see from this diagram below, proportionally how much carbon is stored below ground compared to, say, above ground carbon stored in forests. Unfortunately, however, they are prone to a large number of threats. This is tropical peatlands in terms of conversion to agriculture, drainage, and this makes them dry out and become prone to fire. So fires are also a large issue, and they're what contributes to the annual haze events that we get here in Southeast Asia. And it's that drying out process which brings oxygen into the soils and means that these anoxic environments become oxidated and then release large quantities of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So it's that process of oxidation and the losses to the atmosphere that I really want to cover today. So looking through the literature, and this is a range of literature that I've found for primarily Malaysian, but also some Indonesian studies that have worked on how much gas emissions, how much carbon emissions we're getting from the soils under oil palm plantations. And what we can see is that they range from one very low study of 19, but the vast majority of them are somewhere around about the sort of, 50 to 80 tons of CO2 per hectare per year, okay, from oil palm plantations that are situated on peat soils, okay? Some key ones to take away here. So well-drained soils under RSPO conditions are on the lower side of the emissions factors at around about 46 tonnes. The IPCC published in 2013 with its wetland supplement states 40.3. However, it doesn't account for the process of conversion. HOYE, which is the same data that is used for the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, both put it around about 95 to 100 tons per hectare. And they put it at this high level because they're accounting for the process of converting a forest into oil palm and the rapid oxidation of peat that you get during those initial 5 years, okay? In terms of what does Malaysia use, currently the emissions factors being used by Malaysian reporting for their peatland emissions is 27.5 tonnes. So using the older IPC values that neither accounts for the pulse, but also is not using up-to-date literature or research. So looking at some of the research that I've done in Selangor State on the peatlands there, we have focused on that process of converting peat swamp forests into oil palm plantations. And it's quite interesting because what it identifies is that as you move from the lower emissions that we get in forests, and if you have a look on the left-hand side of the table, this is carbon dioxide. Moving along, you can see this is methane emissions, and then we have nitrous oxide emissions. And it's worth bearing in mind that methane and nitrous oxide are much more powerful greenhouse gases. Nitrous oxide, for example, is about 310 times more powerful in its global warming potential than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. So we use this global warming potential to come up with a total impact of that process in terms of equivalent to CO2, Okay, so the CO2 equivalence in global warming potential of the process of conversion goes from a low value on the far right hand side of 47 tons per hectare equivalents for forests, up to 104, and then a whopping 258 when we consider the very young oil palm plantations. Okay, and then it settles back down, but still very high at 97 tons per hectare for mature oil palm. So we can see a significant increase in the amount of greenhouse gas emissions lost from the soils during those critical stages of conversion, but it remains elevated throughout the entire duration of the oil palm plantation cycle. Okay, and it's worth also bearing in mind that we need to consider not just what is lost, but what is inputted back in. And within forest ecosystems, because they are fixing so much carbon within the biomass, and that carbon then is dropped in terms of leaf litter and branches and roots into the soil, it contributes that carbon back. So in terms of net contribution to the atmosphere, an intact peat forest you can expect to be pretty much neutral, or even in best case scenarios a sink of carbon to the atmosphere. It stores excess carbon. Okay, once we move into plantation forests, although there is a short-term fixation of CO2 through the palm trees themselves, they don't drop litter the same way. They don't contribute as much root biomass. That leaf material has a different chemical composition, and therefore it doesn't get stored for such a long period of time. And therefore, it's much more likely that the vast majority of those losses are not counterbalanced by carbon inputs. Okay, so if we use those emissions factors and we assume a 90 tons per hectare equivalent, so that's in line with the EPA assessments, it's in line with lots of the literature, but it's also in line with the data generated in our study. Or flip back, you can see 97 for mature oil palm. So again, not accounting really for these the process of conversion. So it's certainly not an overestimation. But if we use the 90 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year, then if we upscale that for the area of oil palm on peatlands in Malaysia and Indonesia, we can see that essentially the greenhouse gas emissions from oil palm on peat contribute somewhere between 16 and 27 or 28% of combined national greenhouse gas emissions from Malaysia and Indonesia, okay, which is equivalent to somewhere around about 0.5–0.6% of global greenhouse gas emissions annually. Okay, so a significant contribution. If we look at Malaysia alone, we're using that 90 ton CO2 equivalent again. It contributes about 95 million tons per year, which is somewhere around about 38% of Malaysia's total greenhouse gas emissions as of 2019. Okay, and you may say, well, perhaps we're using emissions factors that are too high. So let's pull it down and use the lower side of it. So this is the 41 tons from one study in Sarawak. But even then, it means oil palm contributes around about 17% of Malaysia's emissions. So it's no small amount. And if we compare that to the emissions reporting for Malaysia, so if we look at the, it's the fourth row down, we have the agricultural emissions and land use change emissions. So not countering anything in terms of what comes back from carbon fixation, but just the emissions, we've got about 17 million tons. Okay, so again, we want to compare that to our literature and our own research, we can see that the emissions factors that have been provided for the whole of Malaysia, for all land use types, all soil types, compared to just the emissions factors for oil palm on peat alone, so one land use and one soil type only, we can see that the emissions factors for the entire country presented are much, much lower than the total emissions factors, regardless of which which value we use, are much lower than the emissions factors for this one land use. So there's clear evidence that effectively there's massive underreporting in terms of the emissions factors for Malaysian peatlands, and this really needs to be contributed much more into the updated UN reporting values for Malaysian land use change in agriculture. So what can we do about this? Well, some people have suggested, well, why don't we compact the peat, reduce the oxygen in it, and therefore we might reduce the emissions? Well, what we've found is when we've done studies on increasing the density, so that's compaction of the peat, we find no relationship between peat compaction and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, what we do find is that all of the variables linked to increased water content in the soil, so raising the water table, all of them contribute to a positive reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions overall. Okay. In addition to that, we've also found that if you compact the peat, if it does then burn because it's dried out, it produces more methane emissions when burnt. So we provide a more sort of toxic concoction in the haze smoke when we have peats that are burnt from compacted areas. What about alternative land uses? So it's not just oil palm. We could think about other crops. Perhaps they're an option. Okay, so we've had a look at emissions from a wide variety of different crop types that are found commonly on peatlands. And again, presenting the CO2 emissions, both in terms of raw emissions, the nitrous oxide emissions, and the methane emissions. And on the right-hand side of each column, you can see that I presented the global warming potential. So that's the equivalent value in carbon dioxide. Okay, its initial strength, as it were. And we can see that if we look at the total global warming potential for these different land uses, we're seeing that really the vast majority of them are very high again. So banana, turmeric, winter melon, and again, our oil palm are all exceptionally high when it comes to their total global warming potential. The only one that's a little bit lower there is pineapple grown in high water tables, okay, which is comparable to the 2 forest sites that we have towards the bottom. These emissions factors also don't add in the values for fire. Okay, so we have a frequency of fires that occur on peatlands within Malaysia. Okay, so it's not correct to just think that they all just occur over the water in Indonesia. We have a significant problem also here in Malaysia linked to agricultural fires. And so we have an average of around about 9 fires a year on Peninsular Malaysia. This doesn't account for East Malaysia at all. And these 9 sort of significant fires contribute an average of just shy of 500,000 tonnes of additional carbon dioxide per year. So it's not a small amount. And so really what I wanted to do is give you a few take-home messages. So the bad news is that essentially carbon losses need to be replaced by leaf litter inputs, and that allows these ecosystems to become carbon sinks or carbon neutral. And we don't get that replacement of organic matter and carbon that's critical for this process occurring within oil palm plantations and croplands. Okay, and then you add to that, unfortunately, is that we also then have to lower the water table for this agriculture. That increases the amount of oxygen that is available within the soil. It increases the rate in which microbial activity can occur. And as well as increasing fire risk, it massively increases the rate of decomposition. So we have our carbon sinks, our important carbon sinks, shifting to significant carbon sources, so much so that they contribute around about 38% of Malaysia's total greenhouse gas emissions. So if we then add to that fertilizers and limings, which again will increase the rate of microbial activity within the soil, they also contribute to additional greenhouse gas emissions. And fertilizers, especially those based on nitrogen, will also have the role of significantly increasing the very important and powerful greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. So we have a sort of threefold process which occurs, which means that these sites become significant sources of CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And it's important also to consider that there is this clear pulse that occurs within the first 5 years, and it's not correct to ignore this. So the biggest pulse will occur when you get the initial conversion from a peat swamp forest to an oil palm plantation. So it's most important to avoid any new conversions from forest to oil palm, because that's where the biggest pulse occurs. But we could expect a secondary pulse to occur every single time there is a new plantation that occurs, so every new cycle, okay? And the current underreporting of Malaysian emissions is clear from the data that we have, okay? And so there needs to be correct accounting for the impact of drained peatlands within Malaysia to really kind of make inwards in taking forward any solutions moving forward. So that takes me on to the second one, which is, I guess, the better news, which is because peat is so prevalent, there's so much peatlands in Malaysia. Malaysia has the potential to be a carbon superpower in terms of their ability to store huge quantities of carbon within the peatlands if rehabilitated. So utilizing something like nature-based solutions will allow us to harness huge quantities of carbon and mitigate much of the annual Malaysian greenhouse gas emissions. So there's significant opportunities for the ever-increasing revenue trend, which is carbon credits and other economic systems based on nature-based solutions and rehabilitation options that are becoming options for Malaysia, okay? And they could help fund these rehabilitation works and help fund alternative livelihoods within these ecosystems. So additional benefits that we get once we start thinking about alternative livelihoods, nature-based solutions within these ecosystems is going to be obviously a massive increase in the biodiversity, because these sites are massively unique, really important for unique and important biodiversity, but they also are important in terms of regulating the amount of water available for nearby agriculture and increasing the water quality, okay? And there's massive potential for tourism based on the rehabilitation of these systems. So we need to be thinking about how we can harness this potential within Malaysia and shift these sites from a significant carbon source to a significant carbon store facility. So I'd like to thank the other members of TRCARI. There's lots of us. We're an ever increasing group based across Southeast Asia and into Europe. And also thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stephanie Evers, for your presentation on greenhouse gas emissions from the management of peatland forests and plantations. Let us move to our last speaker for the panel session today, And I'd like to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Phillip, the Chief Executive Officer of the Malaysia Forest Fund, to share with us on the procedures for greenhouse gas accounting for peatlands used here in Malaysia. Dr. Phillip.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Very good afternoon, Datuk, Datin, ladies and gentlemen. Peatlands and climate change are synonym. There are reports indicating that the emissions from peatland contributes to about 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this figure needs to be carefully examined. Hence, my presentation today would look into the accounting procedures specifically for the peatlands. I would talk about what's peatlands, where is it in the context of IPCC guidelines, and how did Malaysia report its greenhouse gas emissions and removals from the peatlands. To give a context on peatlands, we have to first understand wetlands. Wetlands, as defined under the IPCC guidelines, is any land that is covered or saturated by water for all or a part of the year. And it could occur in land use like in forest, cropland, or grassland categories. So in this context, peat swamp is part of wetlands. So it's a form of wetlands, if you like. So what does, how is peatlands identified? We all agree it's an organic soil, and the soil has to fulfill these criteria, one of these criteria. And this is following FAO definition. IPCC also follows the same definition. So it's up to a country to decide how and where does it report its peatlands. So in order for us to really understand how to do the accounting for peatlands, first of all, we have to understand how is peatlands treated in the IPCC guidelines. Peatlands are reported under the land use change and forestry, or LULUCF, and agriculture sectors. So under the land use change and forestry, usually managed lands are considered for the estimate the greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And they are classified as forest land, cropland, grassland, wetlands, or settlement. So peatland can occur in any of this based on the definitions that we had seen earlier on. However, a country has the flexibility to decide how would it treat the peatlands. So anthropogenic emissions and removals are only considered in any national greenhouse gas inventories or even in any reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. Usually it tracks the changes in the carbon stocks. So to go back again to the IPCC guidelines, the 2006 guidelines, what are the categories under wetlands? Firstly, you have aquaculture, ponds, irrigated land, and so on. So out of these categories, only 2 categories has got methodological guidance. That's on in the rice cultivation and peatlands managed for peat extraction. In this case, it's usually for horticultural or energy purposes. So there's only two guidelines. Unless a country develops its own methodology, most countries would follow what is available. So Malaysia also decided based on this methodologies that we do not report anything under wetlands, peatlands under wetlands, because these activities do not fall under, it's not occurring in Malaysia. I mean, in particular, the peatlands for peat extraction. rice cultivation, yes, we do account for that anyways. So how do Malaysia account for emissions from the peatland? I think this is something that we all need to spend some time to understand. How do we account this? Firstly, we account it from the forest land, that is peatland, peat swamp forest under the forest land category. Croplands, we account for, pardon me, it should be crops planted under the cropland. For wetlands, I have already mentioned earlier on, these are the activities, and we don't have these activities, in particular, number 1. Number 2, conversion to flooded land. There is no methodology under 2006 guidelines, so that's why we don't report that. And water management for rice cultivation is reported under the agriculture. And it's just not rice cultivation, we also look at emissions from fertilizer application, as well as burning of agricultural residuals. So we account for all this. So I just also want to reference the later guidelines from IPCC, wetland supplement, which had included additional categories. It's now also provided guidance, methodological guidance on DOCs from peat fires, re-wetting of organic soils, coastal wetlands, inland wetlands, excuse me. This is for the mineral soil, and constructed wetlands for wastewater. So these are something, excuse me, these are something that Malaysia will have to look at when they are reporting their first biennial transparency report in 2024. So removals from forest land, what did Malaysia consider? Malaysia considered above ground and below ground biomass removals. Emissions, we have accounted for carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide when we when we do commercial harvest, for drained peatland, and fires that occurred, forest fires. And for forest fires, we account for CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, nitrous oxide, CO, and sulfur dioxide, and nitrous oxides. And we do not account for methane that's emitted in the anaerobic condition. So we only account for all anthropogenic emissions and removals. So for cropland, what we have accounted for is above ground biomass for crops that are planted for perennial crops. So what we have accounted for are those oil palm, rubber, and cocoa. But only oil palm is planted in the peatlands. But there's also some pineapple and sago. So in terms of removals, we have only considered oil palm. Whereas emissions, we have looked at harvest, of course, it's only oil palm. Drained peatland covers all areas, whether it's in oil palm, pineapple, or other drained peatlands with cultivation. So as mentioned earlier, also emissions from soil respiration and methane from anaerobic conditions are not considered. This is because it is part of the guidelines which mentioned that these are naturally occurring emissions. So just to conclude, I would like to say back to my first statement when I said 30% of global emissions is from peatlands, perhaps we have to look at that very carefully. What do we mean by 30% is from peatlands when the global emissions from agriculture and forestry is under 30%. Because IPCC guidelines and most country reports only covers CO2 and nitrous oxide emissions from the peatlands. They only consider the removals of CO2 based on annual increments and non-anthropogenic emissions are not considered. So basically, this is what Malaysia has been reporting, and you can look at the details in the first, second, third biennial update report that's available through CASA's website or the Ministry or the UNFCCC website, and we have provided the details in a technical annex. With that, I want to thank you again for giving me this opportunity to share how did we come up with our figures and what peatland accounting entails, and how do we segregate between anthropogenic emissions and naturally occurring emissions. Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Philip, for your presentation on procedures for greenhouse gas accounting for peatlands here in Malaysia. And thank you also to the audience for the questions that you've been contributing during the time of the presentations. Please keep on sharing those questions, and let us now move to the Q&A session and panel discussion. Let me invite the different speakers to the panel. Unfortunately, Dr. Phillips can't join us on the panel today, but if you have any questions for her, we will be forwarding them to her, and she'll respond later. But please, for the other speakers, keep the questions coming in, and let us start the panel session now. So we have a number of questions given to us by the audience. So I'll start off with those that come in following the order that they came in. So firstly, for Dr. Shukri, you mentioned the 3.4% contribution of total greenhouse gas emission coming from agriculture in Malaysia. Does this include the emission from plantation crops like oil palm, or only from other agriculture crops? And secondly, have you taken greenhouse gas emission from the land use change or deforestation into account? Dr. Shukri.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Faisal. Well, to answer the first questions, what I can mention is that under the our national report in 2006, that we are based on the IPCC guidelines. So for agriculture, starting 2016, we have to what we call as be together with forestry. So that's why in my presentation mentioned on the AFOLU, which is under the cluster of agriculture, forestry, and land use estimation. So the number is including forestry and agriculture sector that contributes to the index, or the what we call as the number for the GHG emissions contribution from the agricultural sector. And then yes, it is in the contribution 3.4% for agricultural crop as well. However, in terms of deforestation, it is not under our purview, but in terms of calculation of these GHG emissions, what we can mention here is that after the land is being developed for agricultural lands, including oil palm, so the number of GHG emission is based on the direct nitrous oxide emissions, which is the fertilizer use. For example, urea, that is the main fertilizer being used, and then it actually emits GHG emissions. Yeah. So the calculation is based on the local being developed by Luli et al. In 2007, where we have to calculate by 1.2 kilogram nitrogen per hectare per year. So the direct nitrous oxide emission is based on the emission factor, 1.2 kilogram nitrogen per hectare per year. So that's why we get the contribution of 3.4% of the total, agricultural contribution from the total overall Malaysian contribution to the GHG emissions. So I hope I can answer the questions, Mr. Faisal and the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shukri. The second question is for Dr. Evers. What are examples of nature-based solutions that can be applied to peatlands in Malaysia?
Hi, thanks so much, Faisal. So nature-based solutions are essentially where you're using the natural processes to try and gain benefit. And in this case, it's for mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of for peatlands, the kind of clear requirement is going to be to reduce the level of drainage of the existing peatlands, whether they be, well, obviously for any of the agricultural systems, if you can raise the water table, reduce the level of oxidation, then that's going to reduce the overall emissions that are coming. So that's kind of a short-term fix that will certainly help reduce the emissions overall, but they certainly won't stop them. So even if you increase your water table, so you bring it closer to the surface, you're still going to be bringing in, sort of fairly sort of significant emissions. They're just not going to be as high as we're seeing currently. So that's one option. The other one is to focus on trying to rehabilitate, where possible, land back into peat swamp forest. So obviously you need the inputs of organic matter derived from peat swamp forests that have very unique biochemistry within the leaves, and they help reduce decomposition, the high in carbon, low in nutrient, this organic matter that's produced by the peat swamp forest trees. So bringing back in wetland species into degraded landscapes that are not currently being used for oil palm or can't be adequately managed. Oil palm is a really obvious kind of solution that will essentially bring these systems back to being either carbon neutral, or best case scenario may even start storing excess carbon in the system.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for that response. The second question for Dr. Shukri. Are the organic, the agricultural waste or the oil palm fronds which are left in the field after harvest considered leaf litter, and do they add to the soil carbon store, or do they just directly break down?
Well, okay, to answer the third question this is what we call as the crop residues or biomass after they have been chopped down, and then the residues and the waste being able to be left behind and then being need to be properly managed. Well, the breakdown and direct GHG emission is actually very low. What the figures that are from our reports and from the previous study, it is less than 1%. So the waste, the contribution from the waste is very, very little in terms of contribution to the GHG emissions. Mr. Faisal.
Okay, thank you very much for that. For Stephanie, we have one further question. What in the short term can be done to address the issue of high greenhouse gas emission from peatlands? Are there any quick wins?
It depends on quick, but yes, I mean, as I said, I think, raising the water table across the agricultural sector on peatlands is the quickest win that we can get. Or, it'd be nice to kind of revert them all back to forest. I'm an environmental scientist, but realistically, we're looking at really improving across the country the hydrological management of the peatlands. But in addition to that, really working to keep within guidelines when it comes to the use of fertilizer. So trying to reduce excess application of fertilizer, which can really contribute to additional nitrous oxide emissions, if not sort of done correctly. But in addition to that, we really need to sort of stamp out on the practice that does occur of utilising fire for the change in land use, either for oil palm or for more commonly cropland agriculture. Fire is commonly used even in Peninsular Malaysia to between cycles of vegetable production. So if we can remove that, and then obviously within degraded peatlands that then don't have agriculture on them, focusing on funding programs that can block drains and get the water table back as high as possible, as quickly as possible, is going to have significant net gains on the shorter term. So in combination, we need to be looking at, working in the short term, because that is the time scale that's required to meet emissions factor demands globally.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Just for information, we have about 100 participants online at the moment, so please do keep your questions coming in. I have one additional question for Dr. Shukri. How wise is it to develop new areas for agriculture on peat soil?
Okay, thank you for the questions. This is important. This is very important because as we all know that the peatland should not be disturbed. However, we have some limitation because what we can see in terms of Ministry of Agriculture, our mandate is to our smallholders, the farmers. And the current issues nowadays is limitation or competition to use land areas, especially for mineral soil, crop developments, oil palm, rubber, land development for for new township, etc. So our farmers, they have land, especially at the peat area, so they have to develop this land for agricultural crops, for plantations. So that's why we encourage them to, they can continue in terms of plantation of agricultural crops. So then they can actually reduce their poverty, they can get access, in terms of the gain benefits and profits from their crop productions. If you can see in Johor, for instance, and Sarawak, so pineapple is one of the agricultural crops being planted on the peatland. However, in terms of managing the cultivations, they have to do it wisely in a sustainable manner. For instance, no slash and burns method, which is actually contributes to the GHG emissions. So that's why we encourage them to what we call practice good agricultural practice, GAP. So then in terms of balance in terms of agriculture, conservation, as well as socio-economics and politics. So we have to balance them and encourage them to do proper in terms of agricultural practice. And this is also important in order to reduce the GHG emissions, as the technology being developed and research that I have been presented in my presentation just now. Technologies are there for them to practice in terms of using natural fertilizer, as I mentioned in our research, natural xylite, for instance, with pineapple ash, from the residues of pineapple. So the formulation can actually be
use as fertilizer to develop crop productivity, increase yield, and importantly, at the same time, can actually reduce the GHG emissions. This is my answer. Okay, thank you, Mr. Faisal.
Thank you very much. Stephanie, as I mentioned in the beginning, a few days ago, the Prime Minister announced in Parliament that Malaysia has a target to become carbon neutral by 2050. Even with the measures that you mentioned in place, the short-term measures and other measures, is it feasible for peatland ecosystem in Malaysia to become carbon neutral, so to offset whatever emission is coming from the peatlands over that time frame over the next 30 years? And could peatlands become a net uptake of carbon by that time? Thank you.
Wow. From my perspective, it's going to be quite difficult to offset 38% of the country's emissions. But saying that, if peatlands are managed properly, they can become significant stores of carbon. And in the tropics, this is especially so because the rate of production is very much higher than you get, for example, in temperate regions. So if you can rebalance the inputs and outputs of carbon, then they can start to sort of offset those areas that can't be managed. I'll add that there is an additional problem that is occurring within the oil palm on peat, which is something called subsidence. And this is where essentially the carbon being lost to the atmosphere also, because it's being lost, means that the soil height drops over time. And this can be anywhere between sort of 2 and up to sort of 7 centimeters a year, depending on the level of drainage which occurs in the site. And with that surface soil dropping over time, more and more areas are going to become undrainable. They're going to be subject to flooding. And so they're not going to be usable for agriculture anyway, realistically, over the next sort of 50 to 100 years. And so we're looking at a situation whereby there's multiple factors kind of going on, but effectively it means that the oil palm industry on peatland is on shaky ground in terms of its long-term sustainability, not just because of trying to adhere to emissions factor issues, but also in terms of the inherent loss of surface level. And so, I would say that, looking at mechanisms by which carbon financing and alternative fiscal approaches which pay farmers to rehabilitate their lands, look for alternative agriculture which doesn't require any drainage, so there are some species that can work within wetland conditions, and developing markets for them is a much more prudent approach that we could use in the longer term to be able to achieve these goals. So it's a lot of work, but it can potentially be done.
Thank you very much, both Dr. Shukri and Stephanie Evers, for your very good, helpful discussion on the panel, as well as the in-depth presentations that you made earlier today. I think we have really been very good in a short time period, but a very good snapshot of the understanding of the range of and nature of the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the management of peatlands in Malaysia, and how they can be monitored and assessed and managed. I think moving forward, we need to be looking at the way that we can adjust the management of peatlands in the country towards meeting the targets which have been announced by the government to move towards a climate neutrality by 2050. That's less than 30 years away. That's only one cycle of oil palm plantation away from looking at that new, very different future, which the government has announced as the new direction for the country. I think during the course of the session today, we have learned that peatlands are the most extensive wetland ecosystem in Malaysia, covering 2.6 million hectares. They are also the most important carbon store in the country, storing much more carbon than the biomass of the forests and other ecosystems that are in the country. However, up to 75% of these peatland ecosystems have been developed and converted to agriculture, plantations, urban areas, and other uses over the last 40 to 50 years. And this drainage, clearance, fire, and development in peat is leading to high greenhouse gas emissions. Recent studies, as presented during today's event, have indicated that emissions in Malaysia are significantly higher than were indicated during the earlier documentation and reporting using the default IPCC emission factors. And the latest information implies that between 17 to 38% of all greenhouse gas emission from all sources in Malaysia are coming from peatland, even though the peatlands emitting are less than 5% of the country area. So peatlands are a hotspot for greenhouse gas emission, and it is important to address their management, a sustainable management approach for them. And with the government new target to be carbon neutral by 2050, which is in line with the aspiration of all countries around the world in the framework of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as other international commitments, it's important to see how Malaysia can move forward to address this challenge. I think from the presentation and the panel discussion, we have got some clear ideas and suggestions of the way forward. Firstly, we need to limit or stop the opening up of new peatland areas. Although, as Dr. Shukri mentioned, there are pressures from particularly smallholders or poor communities that they need agricultural land, they need to get income, but much of this can be done through better use, better utilization, and better productivity on the existing land. Even this can also must be applied in the plantation sector, where a poorly managed oil palm plantation on peat may only generate 3 to 5 tons of fresh fruit bunch per hectare per year, and a very well managed plantation can generate almost 30 tons of fresh fruit bunch per year. And with the research being done by the oil palm industry to improve the oil palm types and production, we can see that it will be possible to maintain production but reduce the area of the plantation, and step by step release area back that could be put on the different land management that would lead to neutralize or significantly reduce the greenhouse gas emissions coming from peatlands. But this definitely will be a major challenge and will need to have significant investment. And I think has to take into consideration the fact that the peatlands are unevenly distributed, with some of the states having significantly more peatlands than others, and also pockets of poorer community, in particular the indigenous and local communities that have depended on these peatland areas for long periods of time. We need to look at the future for them. What is the best future vision for them? There is some positive experience in recent years, also on the restoration and community-based rehabilitation of peatlands. We have seen in Selangor State alone, which used to be faced with massive problems of peatland fires, that by working with the plantation sector, agriculture sector, local community, forestry department together, has been possible to reduce by 95% the extent of fires in peatlands through better water management and fire prevention. And these approaches are also now being applied in Pahang State and other states in Malaysia. So it is feasible with relatively low cost to change the trajectory from degraded peatlands to ones which can start to absorb greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, and move towards neutral or even uptake of carbon. In the agricultural landscape, it's very important to be looking at productivity. If we look at the emission per unit amount of crop produced, if we can enhance the productivity per hectare or per land area, we reduce the emissions per unit amount of the crop. And these are important approaches. I believe that the MADI research, which is ongoing, have developed a number of innovative approaches of ameliorants and special management practices, which can significantly reduce emissions as well as improve productivity. And we need to see support for those to be scaled up and to spread out to the key stakeholders. We also need to engage the key stakeholders in the large-scale oil palm sector, which is one of the main land uses on peatlands, and get the whole supply chain to be working together to look at improving the management and production of oil palm on peat, at the same time limiting or stopping the expansion and actually phasing out a plantation on peat before they are faced with significant challenge from subsidence and other factors. So just to conclude, I'd like to again thank each of the three speakers, Dr. Mohammed Shukri, Mat Ali, the Director of Agrobiodiversity and Environment Research Center of the Malaysian Agricultural Research and Development Institute, MADI, Dr. Stephanie Evers, the founder and principal investigator of the Tropical Catchment Research Institute, linked to Nottingham University and John Moores University in Liverpool, who has shared with us on greenhouse gas emission from management of peatland forest and plantation, and Dr. Elizabeth Phillips, the CEO of the newly established Malaysia Forest Fund, for her sharing on the procedures on greenhouse gas accounting for peatlands. I hope all of the audience have found this a very useful and fascinating event, sharing the latest information on greenhouse gas emission from peatlands and management measures that can be taken to reduce those emissions. Just before closing, I'd like to give a little bit of a shout out to the next event that we're having, which is in 2 weeks' time, also on the IGEM platform. And here we're going from Malaysia context to the regional context. We're having representatives from Dr. Wong Suk from the ASEAN Secretariat, sharing on protection and sustainable management of peatland ecosystems in ASEAN. We have Dato' Haji Muhammad Quad, the Director of Forest Management of Forest Department of Peninsular Malaysia, sharing on sustainable management of peatland landscapes in Malaysia as a nature-based solution. Ms. SPM Budi Susanti, who is the Director of the Peatland Directorate of the Government of Indonesia, who's going to share about Indonesia's really international record-breaking, massive-scale peatland rewetting and monitoring program, which is the largest scale peatland restoration program globally operating. And that is very fascinating to hear about that. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Malaysian Department of Environment, Mashita Dawes, on Malaysia's national program for peatland fire prevention. So I hope all of you will be able to tune in 2 weeks' time to our next event and to hear more about some of the practical measures for peatland management and restoration. Thank you again for your participation today, and do keep in touch and keep engaged in the activities. We will be putting the information and videos will be available online, as well as information from presentation. Do visit the Global Environment Center website and the IGEM website for more information. There is the details, www.gec.org.my. Thank you again for your participation today.